The bumper cars are still there. 50,000 of them were ordered for the amusement park that was scheduled to open on May 1st, 1986. It opened once, on April 27th, for a few hours, as a distraction while the evacuation began. Then it closed forever. The Ferris wheel has never completed a full day of operation. The paint on the seats has not faded from use. It has faded from 38 years of weather, radiation, and absolute silence. Pripyat, Ukraine. Population in April 1986, 49,360. Population today, 0. The fourth reactor of the V.I. Lenin nuclear power station exploded at 1:23 a.m. on April 26, 1986. The city built to house the workers and their families lay less than 3 kilometers away. By the evening of April 27th, 36 hours later, every resident had been evacuated. They were told it was temporary. They were told to bring only what they could carry, enough for 3 days. Most of them never returned. The exclusion zone remains. The radiation remains. Pripyat remains, but not as a city, as evidence. If stories like this stay with you, places that ended not over decades but in hours, lives interrupted mid-sentence, entire futures erased by decisions made in distant rooms, consider subscribing. We are working toward our first 1,000, and knowing you are here gives weight to the telling of what happened when a city died while its people were still alive. Walk through Pripyat now, and you walk through April 1986. The calendar in the school still shows the last week. Textbooks open to pages that were being studied when the sirens began. In the hospital, cribs still wait in the maternity ward. Gas masks litter the floor of the kindergarten. Small sizes, meant for children, distributed in the chaos of the second day. A piano sits in the Palace of Culture, its keys untouched since the last concert. The pool where young engineers swam after their shifts is filled with dark water and broken tile. The trees have reclaimed the streets. Apartment balconies collapse under the weight of birch saplings growing through cracked concrete. Moss covers the Soviet slogans that once promised prosperity and progress. There is no running water, no electricity. No one waits for the bus that will never come. The grocery store shelves are empty, but not because anyone bought the last loaf of bread. They are empty because everything was abandoned exactly as it was, and then over years, removed by scavengers, researchers, and the slow rot of time. Dolls lie in the dust of apartment floors. Family photographs curl and fade in rooms where rain now enters through broken windows. The swimming pool, the cinema, the house of culture, the 16 schools, the palace of weddings, all of them stopped mid-function, as if the entire city had been rehearsing for a future that was cancelled without warning. The reactor that exploded is now sealed inside a massive steel structure called the New Safe Confinement, completed in 2016. It is designed to last 100 years. The sarcophagus, built hastily in 1986, is crumbling inside it. Beneath both structures, in the mangled remains of Reactor 4, radioactive material continues to decay. The half-life of plutonium-239 is 24 years. The half-life of a human memory is much shorter. The people who lived in Pripyat are scattered. Some are in Kiev, some are in Slavutish, the city built to replace Pripyat for the workers who continued to operate the remaining reactors until the plant was finally shut down in 2000. Some are dead, not all from radiation, but the liquidators, the firefighters, the plant operators who stayed to prevent a worse catastrophe. Most of them did not survive long. Some are still alive, in their 60s and 70s now, carrying inside them the memory of a city that no longer exists, except as a ruin and a warning. Pripyat was not an old city. It was born in 1970, built specifically to house the scientists, engineers, and workers of the Chernobyl nuclear power plant. It was a young city, an educated city, a Soviet showcase of modernity and atomic optimism. The average age of its residents was 26. There were 15 kindergartens and 5 secondary schools, because the population was growing fast. Families with small children drawn by good salaries, new apartments, and the promise of a future built on the peaceful atom. It was supposed to be a city of the future. In a way, it is. A future that ended before it could begin. The question is not what happened. The explosion happened. The evacuation happened. The exclusion zone happened. The question is deeper and harder to answer. Can a city die in a single night while its people are still alive? Because Pripyat did not die from exhaustion, or economic collapse, or slow abandonment. It died from a decision. The decision to evacuate was made in Moscow, 36 hours after the explosion, when the radiation measurements could no longer be ignored. The decision to make the evacuation permanent came later, as the scale of contamination became undeniable. The residents of Pripyat did not choose to leave their city. The city was taken from them, and yet they are still alive. They still remember the address of the apartment they will never enter again. They still know which balcony was theirs, which school their children attended, which bench they sat on in the park. The city is gone, but the people who lived there are not. They carry Pripyat inside them, a place that exists now only in memory and in the slow decay of concrete and steel. To understand what was lost, one must first understand what was there. Pripyat was 16 years old when it died. The foundation was laid in 1970 in a bend of the Pripyat River, on land that had been forest and farmland. The reason was simple. The Soviet Union was building the VI Lenin nuclear power plant, and nuclear power plants need workers, and workers need homes. Company towns were not new. What was new was the scale of ambition. Pripyat would not be a collection of barracks or a utilitarian settlement. It would be a model Soviet city, wide avenues, green spaces, modern apartments with central heating and hot water, cultural facilities, schools, a hospital that could serve 50,000 people. It would be a city that proved the atom was not just powerful, but civilizing. The first residents arrived in 1970, when only a few buildings were finished. They were young, engineers, construction workers, technicians, many of them fresh from university, drawn by salaries that were 20% higher than the national average, and by the chance to work on the most advanced technology the Soviet Union possessed. They lived in temporary housing at first, but they were building their own future. Every year, new apartment blocks rose. Every year, the population grew. By 1979, Pripyat had 30 EUSDR residents. By 1985, it had reached 47 EUSDRs. In April 1986, it was just over 49 GO0 and still growing. The average age was 26. This was a city of newlyweds and young children. The maternity ward was never empty. Kindergartens expanded constantly. The youngest resident of Pripyat was born on April 25, 1986, the day before the explosion. The birth registry shows the entry. The child was evacuated the next evening, less than 2 days old. Life in Pripyat was, by Soviet standards, exceptionally good. The apartments were new. Most families had television sets, refrigerators, washing machines, luxuries that much of the USSR still lacked. There were no waiting lists for housing, as there were in Kiev or Moscow. If you worked at the plant, you were guaranteed an apartment, usually within months. The grocery stores were better stocked than in most cities. Meat, cheese, fruit, things that required connections or hours of queuing elsewhere, were simply available. The bakery on Lenina Prospect made fresh bread twice a day. The outdoor market sold vegetables from local farms. The cafeteria at the plant served subsidized meals. People saved money. They bought furniture, motorcycles, dakas in the countryside. The city was organized around work, but it was not joyless. The Palace of Culture, energetic, hosted concerts, film screenings, dance nights, amateur theatre. The swimming pool, Lazurny, was open year-round, heated, with a diving platform and lanes for serious swimmers. The sports complex had gymnasiums, a shooting range, weight rooms. There were 15 libraries. There was a cinema, Prometheus, which showed new Soviet films and occasionally foreign ones. There were cafes where young couples met after shifts. There was a restaurant, Pripyat, with white tablecloths and a menu that included Georgian wine and Crimean cognac. The schools were excellent. Teachers were well paid and motivated. Students competed in mathematics Olympiads and sent delegates to regional science fairs. The curriculum emphasized physics, chemistry, mathematics. The children of Pripyat were being prepared to follow their parents into technical careers. Many of them wanted to. Working at the nuclear plant was prestigious. It meant you were trusted with the future. The reactor operators worked in shifts, day shift, night shift, rotating. When the shift changed, the streets filled with workers on bicycles and motorcycles, heading home or heading in. The plant operated around the clock. So did the city. The bakery baked bread at 3 in the morning for the night shift workers coming off duty. The cafeterias served hot meals at all hours. Pripyat never fully slept. On weekends, families walked along the river. In summer, they swam in the cooling pond near the plant, which was warmer than the river because of the heat discharged from the reactors. Children played in the forests that surrounded the city, picking mushrooms and berries. In winter, people skated on the pond and skied in the woods. The city was green, almost half of its area designated as parkland. The planners had been generous with space. The buildings were separated by lawns and rows of birch and pine. Even in the center it felt open, uncluttered, full of light and air. The amusement park was under construction in early 1986. It was supposed to open on May 1st, International Workers' Day, a major Soviet holiday. The Ferris wheel had been assembled. The bumper cars were in crates, waiting to be installed. The parachute drop tower stood ready. There would be food stalls, music, fireworks. The children of Pripyat had been talking about it for months. Some of them were counting the days. No one in Pripyat thought the reactors were dangerous. The official line was that Soviet nuclear technology was the safest in the world. The RBMK reactor design was described as incapable of exploding. Plant workers believed this. Their families believed this. The city existed because of the plant, and the plant was a source of pride. When the fourth reactor was commissioned in 1983, there was a celebration. When the first and second reactors set production records, there were bonuses and commendations. The plant was not feared. It was the reason Pripyat had heat in winter, food in the stores, apartments with balconies overlooking parks. The plant was the future. There were small signs, if anyone had wanted to read them. Minor accidents at the plant were not publicized. In 1982, Reactor 1 experienced a partial meltdown, contained and repaired without public acknowledgement. Safety drills were rare. The reactor operators were confident, sometimes overconfident. The RBMK design had flaws, a positive void coefficient that made it unstable under certain conditions, control rods with graphite tips that could briefly increase reactivity instead of reducing it. But these flaws were known only to a few specialists and not fully understood even by them. The plant management prioritized production over caution. Bonuses were tied to meeting output targets, not to safety margins. But these were not things the residents of Pripyat thought about. They thought about their children's grades, about the new furniture arriving from Kyiv, about the upcoming May Day celebrations, about summer vacations at the Black Sea. They thought about the future their city promised: clean, modern, prosperous, Soviet, and permanent. On the night of April 25, 1986, most of Pripyat was asleep. A few hundred people were awake. the night shift at the plant, the bakers preparing morning bread, the nurses in the maternity ward, teenagers walking home from late parties. The lights in the apartment blocks were mostly dark. The streets were quiet. The reactors, all 4 of them, were running. At the plant, Reactor 4 was scheduled for a safety test, an experiment to see if the turbines could generate enough electricity during coast down to power the emergency cooling system in the event of a grid failure. The test had been delayed. It was now being conducted during the night shift, with a crew that had not been fully briefed. The reactor was operating at low power, an unstable state for an RBMK design. At 1:23 a.m., the operators attempted to raise power rapidly by withdrawing control rods. The reactor became prompt critical. The power surge was instantaneous and uncontrollable. 2 explosions followed within seconds. The reactor core ruptured. The 1,000-ton steel and concrete lid was blown off. Radioactive material vented directly into the atmosphere. The graphite moderator blocks ignited. The fire burned for 10 days. In Pripyat, 3 kilometers away, some people heard the explosions. Some saw a blue light in the sky, Cherenkov radiation, ionized air glowing from the intensity of the release. Most people slept through it. By morning, the city would wake to a day that looked like any other, and by the next evening, it would be empty. The morning of April 26th was a Saturday. Children were home from school. Families slept late or made plans for the weekend. The bakery on Lenina Prospect opened at 7. People bought bread for breakfast, chatted about the weather, noticed nothing unusual. The explosions in the night had been distant enough, muffled enough, that most of Pripyat had not woken. Those who had heard something assumed it was construction work, or equipment being moved at the plant, or thunder from a passing storm. At the plant, the situation was already catastrophic. The roof of Reactor 4 was gone. Fires burned in multiple locations. Radioactive debris lay scattered across the site. 2 workers were dead within hours, 1 killed by falling debris, 1 by steam burns. The radiation levels were so high that dosimeters maxed out and stopped measuring. The firefighters who arrived first had no idea what they were fighting. They climbed onto the roof with hoses. They aimed water into the burning core. Their boots stuck to melted bitumen. Within hours, they were vomiting. Within days, most of them were dying. The plant management did not immediately inform the city authorities. The first official acknowledgement came at 5 a.m. when the plant director called the local Communist Party headquarters to report a fire. The word explosion was not used. The word radiation was not mentioned. At 6 a.m., a special commission was formed in Kyiv. At 8 a.m., the commission arrived by helicopter. By then, the graphite fire was fully developed, and the plume of radioactive smoke was drifting north and west, over Pripyat and beyond. In the city, life continued. Children played outside. Couples walked along the river. The outdoor market opened. The cafes served breakfast. A wedding was scheduled for that afternoon at the Palace of Weddings. The bride and groom arrived. The ceremony proceeded. Photographs were taken on the steps overlooking the river, with the plant visible in the background. The smoke from the fire was visible too, a dark column rising into a clear spring sky. People pointed at it. Some worried, most did not. No official warning was issued. The city's civil defense authorities had received instructions from the plant, but those instructions were vague and contradictory. Radiation measurements were being taken in the streets, but the results were not made public. At noon, some schools were quietly closed. Some parents were called and told to keep their children indoors. But there was no general alarm, no evacuation order, no explanation. The radio broadcast normal programming. The television showed normal programming. The city administration met in emergency session, but issued no statement. By afternoon, rumors were spreading. Plant workers who had been on duty during the night were home now. telling their families what they had seen. Firefighters who had fought the blaze were in the hospital, their skin red and blistered, vomiting uncontrollably. Radiation detectors brought into apartments showed readings far above normal. Some families began packing, some left on their own, driving to relatives in Kyiv or villages outside the zone. But most stayed, uncertain, waiting for official guidance that did not come. The decision to evacuate was made in Moscow on the afternoon of April 27th, more than 36 hours after the explosion. The Politburo convened. The measurements could no longer be ignored. The radiation levels in Pripyat were lethal over time. Children playing in the streets were accumulating doses that would cause cancer. Pregnant women were being exposed to isotopes that would damage their fetuses. The city could not remain inhabited. The evacuation order was issued at 2 p.m. The announcement would be made at 3 p.m. The evacuation would begin at 4 p.m. At 3 p.m., loudspeakers throughout the city broadcast a message. The voice was calm, bureaucratic, emotionless. Attention, comrades. The City Council informs you that due to the accident at Chernobyl power station in the city of Pripyat, the radioactive conditions in the vicinity are deteriorating. The Communist Party, its officials and the armed forces are taking necessary steps to combat this. Nevertheless, with the view to keep people as safe and healthy as possible, the children being top priority, we need to temporarily evacuate the citizens in the nearest towns of Kyiv Oblast. For these reasons, starting from April 27, 1986 at 2 p.m., each apartment block will be able to have a bus at its disposal. It is highly advisable to take your documents, some vital personal belongings, and a certain amount of food, just in case, with you. The senior executives of public and industrial facilities of the city has decided on the list of employees needed to stay in Pripyat to maintain these facilities in a good working order. All the houses will be guarded by the police during the evacuation period. Comrades, leaving your residences temporarily, please make sure you have turned off the lights, electrical equipment and water, and closed the windows. Please keep calm and orderly in the process of this short-term evacuation. Short-term, temporarily, 3 days, maybe a week. That is what people believed, because that is what they were told. They packed small bags, a change of clothes, documents, photographs, food for the journey, medication, toys for the children. They locked their doors. They left keys with neighbors who were staying. They assumed they would return. At 4 p.m., the buses arrived. 1,200 buses, requisitioned from across Ukraine. A convoy stretching for kilometers. They lined up in front of every apartment block. The streets filled with people carrying suitcases, bags, children. The loading was orderly, methodical, Soviet. Families were assigned to buses. Buses filled and departed. More buses arrived. The operation continued for 3 hours. By 7 p.m., the city was empty. The residents were taken to reception centers in towns south and west of the exclusion zone. They were registered. They were told to wait for further instructions. Some were sent to stay with relatives. Some were housed in hotels, dormitories, schools converted into temporary shelters. They were told the evacuation was precautionary. They were told Pripyat was being decontaminated. They were told they would return soon. They did not return. On May 2nd, the exclusion zone was expanded to 30 kilometers. Pripyat was inside it. On May 6th, the authorities announced that the evacuation was permanent. Residents would be relocated. They would be compensated. They could not go home. Some refused to believe it. Some traveled back to the zone on their own, sneaking past checkpoints, returning to their apartments to retrieve belongings the evacuation had not allowed them to take. Some succeeded. Most were turned back by soldiers and police, now guarding the perimeter. The city was closed. The city was contaminated. The city was dead. What they left behind was everything. furniture, books, kitchens full of dishes, closets full of clothes, children's drawings on refrigerators, family albums, letters, diplomas, wedding dresses, the piano in the Palace of Culture, the paintings in the art school, the specimens in the biology lab, the records in the city archives, the files in the hospital, the inventory in the stores. All of it remained, frozen in place, waiting for people who would never return. The exclusion zone was established on May 2, 1986, a 30-kilometer radius around the reactor, encompassing not just Pripyat, but 92 other villages and towns. The total number of people evacuated from the zone eventually reached 116, zero. Pripyat was the largest, but it was not the only community erased. The zone was sealed. Military checkpoints controlled every road in and out. Soldiers in protective gear patrolled the perimeter. No one was allowed to enter without authorization. No one was allowed to leave without being checked for contamination. The abandoned cities and villages became a controlled territory, administered not by civil authorities, but by a special directorate answering directly to Moscow. Inside the zone, the work began. The graphite fire in Reactor 4 burned for 10 days. Helicopters dropped sand, clay, lead, and boron onto the burning core, 5,000 tons of material, attempting to smother the fire and absorb the radiation. The pilots flew through the radioactive plume. They received doses in minutes that would have taken years under normal circumstances. Some of them died within weeks. When the fire was finally extinguished, the work of containment began. The reactor had to be entombed. The Soviet government mobilized an army of workers, soldiers, miners, engineers, construction crews. They were called liquidators. Over the next 2 years, more than 600 Auzhagurzhan people worked in the zone. Most of them were conscripts, young men doing military service, ordered to Chernobyl and given minimal protective equipment. They worked in shifts measured not in hours, but in seconds of radiation exposure. A soldier might shovel radioactive debris from the roof of Reactor 3 for 90 seconds, then be rotated out, his lifetime dose limit reached. They built the sarcophagus around Reactor 4, a massive structure of concrete and steel, erected in 6 months under conditions that defied normal construction methods. Workers operated cranes remotely. Robots were sent in to clear debris, but the radiation destroyed their electronics. Men went in instead, working in relays, each man spending a few minutes in lethal environments, then retreating. The sarcophagus was completed in November 1986. It was never meant to be permanent. It was meant to last 30 years. It began cracking within 10. In Pripyat, decontamination efforts were attempted and then abandoned. Crews washed the streets with special solutions meant to bind radioactive particles. They stripped topsoil from parks and playgrounds. They cut down trees. They painted buildings with sealant. None of it worked. The contamination was too deep, too widespread, too persistent. Cesium-137 had settled into the soil. Strontium-90 had entered the groundwater. Plutonium isotopes lay in the dust. The half-lives were measured in decades and centuries. Decontamination was impossible. The city could not be saved. The Soviet government made a decision. Pripyat would not be demolished. It would be left standing, maintained minimally to prevent collapse, preserved as it was. Officially, this was for future scientific study. Unofficially, it was simpler and cheaper than trying to dismantle and bury a radioactive city. The apartment blocks, the schools, the hospital, the Palace of Culture, all of it remained, empty but intact. In the first years after the evacuation, the city decayed slowly. Looters came despite the radiation, despite the soldiers. They broke into apartments and took anything valuable: televisions, furniture, rugs, lamps. Some of it was sold in markets in Kiev and beyond, contaminated goods spreading low levels of radiation into the general population. The authorities eventually cracked down, but by then much had been taken. What the looters did not take, time and weather destroyed. Windows broke, roofs leaked, rain entered the buildings, floors warped, walls crumbled, pipes burst in winter, flooding apartments. Mold spread. The trees, no longer cut back, grew wild. Birch saplings sprouted in cracks in the pavement, in courtyards, on balconies. Within a decade, parts of Pripyat looked less like a city and more like ruins reclaimed by forest. The human cost became clear slowly, then all at once. The firefighters who responded on the first night, 28 of them died within 4 months from acute radiation syndrome. Their bodies were so contaminated, they were buried in lead-lined coffins in a Moscow cemetery. The plant workers who stayed to prevent further meltdowns, who manually operated valves and pumps in irradiated areas, many of them died within a year. The helicopter pilots, dead. The liquidators who shoveled graphite off the roof with hand tools, dead or dying, or living with cancers that appeared years later. The official Soviet death toll from Chernobyl was 31. This number counted only immediate deaths from radiation exposure in the first months. It did not count the cancers. It did not count the thyroid diseases in children who drank contaminated milk. It did not count the leukemia, the birth defects, the stillbirths, the immune disorders. The true death toll is unknown and contested. Some estimates place it in the thousands, some in the tens of thousands. The radiation spread across Europe. Cesium fallout was detected in Sweden, in Germany, in Italy. The contamination will persist for lifetimes beyond counting. The residents of Pripyat were scattered across Ukraine and beyond. The Soviet government promised them new apartments, compensation, priority in housing lists. Some received what was promised. Many did not. Families were split. People who had lived next door to each other for 15 years ended up in different cities, losing contact. The community that had been Pripyat dissolved. A new city was built for the plant workers who remained. Slavutich, 50 kilometers from the reactor, outside the zone, but close enough to bus in for shifts. The Chernobyl plant did not close in 1986. Reactors 1, 2, and 3 continued operating. There was a labor shortage across the Soviet Union, and the electricity was needed. Workers lived in Slavutich and commuted by train through the exclusion zone to work at a plant where 1 reactor was entombed, and 3 were running. Reactor 2 was shut down after a fire in 1991. Reactor 1 closed in 1996. Reactor 3, the last one, operated until December 15, 2000. When it finally stopped, the Chernobyl nuclear power plant ceased to exist as a functioning facility. It became exclusively a containment and decommissioning site. Some of the evacuees tried to return, not officially, not legally. But in the years after the disaster, elderly residents from the villages around Pripyat began sneaking back into the zone. They were mostly women, babushkas in their 60s and 70s, who decided they would rather die in their own homes than in unfamiliar cities. The authorities tried to stop them. Then they gave up. A few hundred people, no one knows the exact number, live illegally in the zone now, in villages that are officially uninhabited, growing vegetables in contaminated soil, drinking water from contaminated wells, waiting to die in the places they refuse to leave. Pripyat has no such returnees. It was too young a city. Its residents were too young. They had futures elsewhere. They rebuilt their lives in Kiev, in Slavutich, in other cities across Ukraine and Russia. They married again, had more children, found new jobs. But they did not forget. Reunions are held annually, gatherings of former residents who meet to remember the city that was taken from them. They bring photographs, they tell stories. They ask each other, "Do you remember the bakery, the pool, the amusement park that never opened, the apartment we lived in, the school our children attended, the night everything ended. They remember a city that no longer exists except as a ruin, a radiation zone, a symbol of the worst nuclear disaster in history. And they are still alive. That is the strange cruelty of it. Pripyat died in a single night, but the people who lived there did not. They carry it with them, a city that exists now only in memory and in the slow, silent decay of concrete, steel, and broken glass. Pripyat today is administered by the State Agency of Ukraine on exclusion zone management. It is not a city, it is a site, a destination for scientists studying radiation ecology, for engineers maintaining the sarcophagus and its successor structure, for guards who patrol the perimeter, and increasingly for tourists. Tourism began unofficially in the late 1990s. Journalists, photographers, urban explorers, people willing to bribe guards or sneak past checkpoints to document the ruins. The photographs spread. Pripyat became famous in a way it had never been when it was alive. The abandoned amusement park, the Ferris wheel that never turned, the classrooms with textbooks still open, the hospital with rusted cribs. These images circulated globally, symbols of Cold War failure, of technological hubris, of apocalypse frozen in time. In 2011, the Ukrainian government legalized tourism to the zone. Organized tours now bring thousands of visitors each year. They travel in buses from Kiev, pass through checkpoints, sign liability waivers, carry dosimeters. Guides lead them through Pripyat on carefully planned routes: the main square, the Palace of Culture, the swimming pool, the amusement park. They are told not to touch anything, not to sit on furniture, not to pick up objects, not to stray from the paths. The radiation is lower now than it was in 1986, but it is still present. The ground is still contaminated. Certain buildings are still dangerous to enter. The tourists take photographs. They stand in front of the Ferris wheel. They pose in the classrooms. Some treat it with reverence. Some treat it as a backdrop for social media. The guides, many of whom are former residents or children of former residents, narrate the history in practice scripts. They point out details, the slogan on the school wall, the propaganda posters fading in the Palace of Culture, the swimming pool where they once swam. They answer questions. They correct misconceptions. They try to convey that this was not always a ruin. It was a city. People lived here. The new safe confinement was completed in 2016, 30 years after the disaster. It is a massive arch of steel, 108 meters high, 257 meters wide, designed to last 100 years and contain the radioactive remains of Reactor 4 while the slow work of dismantling the destroyed core proceeds. It was built away from the reactor, then slid into place on rails. The radiation levels were still too high to construct it directly over the site. It cost over $2 billion, funded by international contributions. It is the largest movable land-based structure ever built. It dwarfs the ruins of Pripyat. From the city, the arch is visible on the horizon, a gleaming monument to containment and failure. Inside the old sarcophagus, now enclosed within the new structure, the fuel remains. Approximately 200 tons of uranium and plutonium, mixed with concrete, steel, graphite, and melted sand, solidified into formations the workers called elephant's foot. Corium, a lava-like radioactive mass that formed when the molten core burned through the reactor floor. In 1986, standing near the elephant's foot would kill a person in minutes. Today, it would take hours. Eventually, it will take days, then weeks, then years. The radiation decays, but not quickly enough for human timescales. The plan is to dismantle Reactor 4 entirely, piece by piece, using remote-controlled equipment. The plan will take decades. The plan requires technology that does not yet fully exist. The plan costs money Ukraine does not have. The plan proceeds slowly, if at all. The other 3 reactors are being decommissioned. Spent fuel is being removed and stored in massive concrete casks on the site. The turbine halls are being stripped. The control rooms are being decontaminated. The process will take until 2065, according to current estimates. Longer if funding fails. The Chernobyl site will never be fully clean. The best outcome is stable containment for centuries, until the radiation decays to levels that are merely hazardous rather than lethal. Pripyat will outlast the people who lived there. The apartment blocks are structurally sound, built to Soviet standards with thick concrete walls and steel frames. They will stand for decades more, perhaps a century, before collapsing entirely. The trees will continue to grow. The forest will reclaim the streets. Already wolves roam the zone. Deer, boar, lynx, even European bison have returned to the abandoned lands. Without humans, the wildlife thrives, despite the radiation. Animals born in the zone carry cesium in their bones, but they breed and survive. Nature adapts. The exclusion zone has become, unintentionally, a wildlife reserve. The former residents are aging. The youngest evacuees, the children of 1986, are in their 40s now. The oldest are in their 80s. Some have died. More will die. Each year the reunions grow smaller. Each year fewer people remain who remember Pripyat as it was, not as a ruin, but as a home. There were legal battles, compensation claims, lawsuits against the Soviet government, and later the Ukrainian state. Some residents received apartments in new cities, small pensions, medical monitoring. Others received nothing, or received promises that were never fulfilled. The Soviet Union collapsed in 1991, 5 years after Chernobyl. The bureaucracy that had evacuated Pripyat dissolved. Records were lost. Responsibilities were disputed. Many former residents gave up fighting for what they were owed. It was easier to move forward than to demand justice from a state that no longer existed. What was lost cannot be compensated. The city itself, the community, the continuity of life, the assumption that tomorrow would resemble yesterday, the belief that the future was secure. These things have no price, no legal remedy, no replacement. Some former residents visit Pripyat on the organized tours. They walk through the ruins of their former homes. They stand in front of the building where they lived, looking up at windows they once looked out of. They remember which apartment was theirs, 4th floor, 3rd window from the left. They remember the view. They remember the neighbors. They remember the morning of April 26th, the announcement on the loudspeakers, the buses arriving, the journey out. They remember believing they would return. They did not return. They will not return. Pripyat is uninhabitable and will remain so for lifetimes beyond counting. The exclusion zone will persist long after everyone who remembers the city as it was has died. The ruins will stand, slowly crumbling, slowly vanishing, slowly being swallowed by the forest that was there before the city was built. And in the end, there will be nothing left but silence, radiation, and the stories people tell about the city that died in a single night while its people were still alive. The question was asked at the beginning, can a city die in a single night while its people are still alive? The answer is yes, and the answer is no. Pripyat died on April 27, 1986, when the last bus left and the city became empty. The buildings remained. The streets remained. But a city is not buildings and streets. A city is the people who live in it, the routines they keep, the relationships they build, the future they assume. When the people left, the city ended. It did not collapse. It did not burn. It simply stopped being a city and became a place where a city used to be. But the people did not die. They left. They scattered. They rebuilt. Valentina Ivanovna, who worked as a kindergarten teacher in Pripyat, now lives in Kyiv. She is 73. She still has the photographs from her classroom, Children she taught in 1985 and early 1986. She knows what happened to some of them. Others she has lost track of. She does not visit Pripyat. She says there is nothing there for her to see. The building is there, but the children are not. Nikolai Petrovich was a reactor operator on the night shift in Reactor 3 when Reactor 4 exploded. He survived. He was evacuated with his wife and 2 sons. He worked at other nuclear plants afterward, because that was what he knew how to do. He retired in 2010. He visits Pripyat once every few years, on the anniversary. He says it is important to remember, but he does not say what exactly should be remembered. The city, the disaster, the failure, or the life that was there before. Lyudmila Pavlovna was 9 years old when she left Pripyat. She remembers the amusement park that never opened. She remembers being excited about the Ferris wheel. She remembers the evacuation, the bus ride, her mother crying quietly while telling her it would be fine. She is 47 now. She has children of her own. She has shown them photographs of Pripyat. They ask her what it was like. She tells them it was normal. That is what she remembers most. It was a normal place. People lived normal lives. Then it ended. What was lost is more than a city. It was trust. The Soviet Union told its people that nuclear energy was safe, that the reactors could not fail, that the atom was the future. And then the reactor exploded. The state told the residents of Pripyat they would return in 3 days. They never did. The promises were broken. The belief that the state would protect its people, that expertise meant safety, that the future was guaranteed, all of it shattered. What was lost is continuity. Families had lived in the region for generations. The villages around Pripyat were centuries old. The evacuation severed that connection. There is no one left to tend the graves, to remember the old stories, to pass down the knowledge of which fields flooded in spring and which wells never ran dry. The land is still there. The people are gone. The continuity is broken. What was lost is specific and irreplaceable. The photographs left behind. The letters never retrieved. The toys children were not allowed to take. The furniture built by hand. The gardens planted each spring. The routines of daily life. The walk to work. The Saturday market. The evening by the river. These things existed. They mattered. They are gone. Pripyat is not unique. Cities have died before. They will die again. What makes Pripyat different is the speed and the visibility. Most cities die slowly. Industry leaves, people follow. Buildings decay over decades. Pripyat died overnight, and it was preserved, intentionally or not, as a monument to that death. The ruins are still there. The exclusion zone ensures they will remain. Pripyat is a visible ghost, a city stopped mid-breath, a reminder that the places we build and the lives we live are more fragile than we want to believe. The radiation will decay. In 300 years, Pripyat will be safe to inhabit again, in theory. In practice, no one will rebuild it. The world will have moved on. The memory will have faded. The ruins, if they still stand, will be curiosities, archaeological sites, footnotes in history. The people who remember Pripyat as a living city will be dead. Their children will be dead. The city will exist only in records, in photographs, in documentaries like this one. Can a city die in a single night while its people are still alive? Yes. Pripyat did. The buildings stand empty. The people live elsewhere. The city is gone. The people remain, carrying it inside them, a place that exists now only in memory, in longing, in the unanswerable question of what life would have been if the reactor had not exploded, if the evacuation had not happened, if the future they believed in had been allowed to continue. If this story has stayed with you, the city that ended in a day, the people who carry it still, the silence that replaced the sound of 49,000 lives, please like and subscribe. We are working toward our first 1,000 subscribers, and your support allows us to continue telling these stories. Let us know in the comments which vanished city or abandoned place you would like us to investigate next. There are many. Too many. Each one mattered. Each one deserves to be remembered. Thank you for bearing witness.